Genghis Khan's own bones may be lying in an unmarked grave somewhere in Mongolia, hidden on purpose, and scientists just found something in his descendants' blood that changes everything we thought we knew about who the Mongols really were. If this story pulls at something in you, stay close, because by the end you might see your own family's hidden story a little differently too. For centuries, we told ourselves one simple story about the Mongols: savage horsemen, brutal conquerors, a wall of screaming riders sweeping across Asia and Europe, burning cities and vanishing into legend. That is the image most of us grew up with. Barbarians on horseback, nothing more. But what if that image was built by the people who feared them, not by the people who actually lived among them? What if the real Mongols were something far more complicated, far more human, and far more surprising than any movie ever showed us? That question sat quietly for hundreds of years. Nobody could answer it because the only evidence we had came from old manuscripts written by scared scribes in conquered cities. Of course, those writers made the Mongols sound like monsters. Would you write kindly about the army that just burned your home? But history is not only written in ink. Sometimes it is written inside our bones. And recently, scientists learned how to read that second kind of history. They call it ancient DNA. And when they finally pointed that tool at the Mongol world, the results were not what anyone expected. Let's go back to the beginning, back to the story most of us were taught. In the early 1200s, a man named Temujin rose from almost nothing. His father was poisoned when he was a boy. His family was abandoned by their own tribe, left to survive alone on the harsh Mongolian steppe. Most children in that situation would have died quietly and been forgotten. Instead, Temujin survived. He fought. He made alliances. He broke them when he needed to, and slowly, piece by piece, he pulled together the scattered tribes of Mongolia into one force. By the year 1206, that broken boy had a new name: Genghis Khan, ruler of all who live in felt tents. What came next is one of the fastest, largest expansions in human history. Within just a few decades, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe. It became the largest connected land empire the world has ever seen. And the way most people remember that expansion is simple: terror. Cities were given a choice: surrender or be destroyed. Some cities that resisted were wiped out almost completely. Stories spread of pyramids made of skulls, of rivers turned red, of entire populations vanishing in a single day. Those stories traveled through Europe and the Middle East for centuries, and slowly the word Mongol stopped meaning a person. It became a symbol of pure destruction. That is the version most of us inherited. Simple, brutal, almost cartoonish in how evil it makes them sound. But somewhere along the way, a quiet question started forming in the minds of historians. If the Mongols were only destroyers, how did their empire last so long? How did trade routes flourish under their rule? How did the famous Silk Road become safer, not more dangerous, once the Mongols controlled it? Destroyers do not usually build the safest trade network in human history. Something did not add up. And that small crack in the old story is where our real journey begins. If you have ever felt like the version of history you were taught left something important out, you are not alone. And this story is about to show you why that feeling was right. For a long time, historians could only guess at what was missing. They had old texts, some biased, some incomplete, some lost entirely. They had ruins. They had legends passed down by word of mouth for generations. But bones do not lie the way old manuscripts sometimes do. And in the last 20 years, something remarkable happened in science. Researchers developed the ability to extract tiny fragments of DNA from ancient skeletons, sometimes thousands of years old, and read the genetic story hidden inside. This technology has already reshaped how we understand human migration, ancient diseases, and lost civilizations. And eventually, scientists turned their attention to the Mongol steppe. What they hoped to find was simple: a clearer picture of who the Mongols actually were, biologically and culturally, before the myths took over. What they found instead opened up a mystery nobody was fully prepared for. The first big shock came from looking at the ordinary people, not the emperors, not the generals, but the everyday nomads who lived across the vast Mongolian grasslands. Genetic studies revealed that the population of the steppe was not one single pure group. It was a mixture, layers upon layers of different ancient peoples, blending together over thousands of years. Some ancestry traced back to ancient herders from the north, some connected to populations further west, closer to what we now call Central Asia. Some genetic threads stretched even further, tying into groups scattered across a huge stretch of the ancient world. In other words, long before Genghis Khan was even born, the people of the steppe were already a blend, already connected to a much wider world than the simple, isolated barbarian tribe image suggests. This alone was surprising, but it was only the beginning. The next question historians and scientists really wanted answered was about Genghis Khan himself. Because for years, there had been a strange and slightly uncomfortable theory floating around. A study from the early 2000s suggested that a huge number of men across Asia, something like 16 million men, might carry a very similar Y-chromosome pattern, one that researchers linked to a powerful male lineage from around the time of the Mongol Empire. The implication was stunning. If true, it meant that Genghis Khan, or a close male relative of his, could be a direct ancestor to a huge slice of modern Asian men. Millions of people alive today, unknowingly carrying a piece of that same bloodline. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere out there, a man delivering food, a teacher, a farmer, a student sitting in a classroom, any one of them might carry a genetic thread stretching back 800 years to one of the most feared conquerors in history and never know it. That idea alone is enough to give you chills, but here is where the story gets even more complicated, and honestly, more human. Scientists could not simply test Genghis Khan's actual remains to confirm this, because his burial site has never been found. According to historical accounts, his followers deliberately hid his grave. Some legends say his funeral procession killed anyone they encountered along the way, just to keep the location secret. Some say horses were used to trample the burial site, until it blended perfectly into the landscape. Whether every detail of those legends is true or exaggerated, one thing is certain. Nearly 800 years later, we still do not know exactly where Genghis Khan is buried. So researchers cannot directly test his DNA. What they have instead is more indirect patterns, statistical connections, comparisons between historical records, geography, and the DNA of men living today across the regions the Mongol Empire once ruled. And this is important because it means we have to be careful. Some researchers strongly support the idea that this widespread genetic pattern really does trace back to Genghis Khan's family line. Other scientists urge more caution, pointing out that powerful ruling families throughout history often left large genetic footprints, simply because of the social power and privilege they held, not necessarily because of one single individual. Historians still debate exactly how much of this pattern belongs specifically to Genghis Khan, and how much belongs to the wider ruling class around him, his sons, his generals, and the powerful families connected to the empire. But even with that uncertainty, the deeper truth remains stunning. Somewhere in the deep genetic threads of millions of people alive right now, there is a real, measurable connection to the Mongol Empire. Not a myth, not a legend, an actual biological echo of that history, still living quietly inside modern bodies. If that gives you goosebumps, imagine how the researchers felt the day the data confirmed it. Now let's slow down for a second, because there is something deeper happening here than just numbers and charts. For centuries, the Mongols were remembered mostly as an idea, a frightening idea used to represent chaos and destruction. But DNA does not just tell us about famous emperors. It tells us about ordinary people too. Farmers, mothers, children, soldiers who were never mentioned in any book. And when scientists studied burial sites across the old Mongol territories, they started noticing something surprising. Genetic diversity. Skeletons from different backgrounds, buried in the same regions, sometimes even in the same communities. People with ancestry tracing back to different parts of Asia, and in some cases, even connections stretching toward parts of the Middle East and Eastern Europe. This tells us something the old destruction-only story completely leaves out. The Mongol Empire was not just an army that destroyed the world. It was also, whether intentionally or not, one of the biggest human mixing events in history. Under Mongol rule, trade. Routes reopened and expanded. Merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and travelers moved across enormous distances more safely than before. People from very different backgrounds ended up living closer to each other, working together, sometimes marrying into each other's families. The empire that terrified so many people also, in a strange twist, connected more of humanity together than almost any other power before it. That is not the story most of us were taught in school. We were taught fear. We were not taught connection. And that leads to one of the biggest curiosity loops in this whole story. If the Mongols really were only mindless destroyers, why does their genetic legacy show up as diversity and connection instead of simple destruction? The answer scientists are slowly uncovering is more nuanced and honestly more emotional than the simple villain story ever allowed. Yes, the Mongol conquests were violent. Historians agree on that. Cities were destroyed. Lives were lost on a massive scale. That part of history is real, and it should never be erased or softened just to make a better story, but violence was not the whole story. It was one chapter in a much longer, much more complicated book. Once regions came under Mongol control, something unexpected often happened. The Mongols, in many cases, allowed different religions to be practiced freely. Buddhist monks, Christian priests, and Muslim scholars sometimes lived and worked within the same Mongol courts. Trade was encouraged. Knowledge was shared. Ideas, inventions, and even diseases moved along those same reopened roads, spreading further and faster than ever before. The DNA evidence we see today is, in a way, the quiet fingerprint of all of that movement. Every genetic thread connecting distant populations tells a small, silent story. A merchant who settled somewhere new, a soldier who never went home, a family that crossed a border and stayed, a marriage between two people who never would have met without that empire connecting their worlds. History books gave us battles and dates. DNA is giving us something softer and somehow more powerful. It's giving us the human relationships hidden underneath all those battles and dates. If you're starting to feel like this story is more about people than conquerors, you're exactly right, and it's about to get even more personal. Let's shift focus now to something even more surprising: the physical remains of Mongol-era people themselves. For a long time, popular imagination pictured Mongol warriors as one single uniform type. Same look, same background, same style of life. But when scientists examined ancient burial sites more closely, using both DNA analysis and detailed study of bones and grave items, they found something far more layered. Some burial sites revealed elite warriors buried with elaborate weapons, fine clothing remnants, and symbols of high status. Others revealed ordinary herders, simple burials, everyday tools. Some remains showed signs of old injuries, healed over time, hinting at long, hard lives of survival rather than simple glory. And crucially, genetic analysis on many of these skeletons showed mixed ancestry, not one pure bloodline, but overlapping threads from different regions and different peoples. This challenges something deeper than just the barbarian myth. It challenges the whole idea that ancient nations were simple, pure, single groups of people, untouched by outside influence. The truth the DNA reveals is messier and far more real. Human history has almost always been a story of mixing, moving, and blending, even when the people living it did not fully realize it themselves. The Mongols were not an exception to that pattern. In many ways, they became one of history's clearest examples of it. Now here is where the story quietly turns towards something deeply personal, something that reaches far beyond ancient Mongolia and touches millions of lives happening right now, today. Modern genetic testing has exploded in popularity over the last decade. People send in simple saliva samples, hoping to learn where their ancestors came from. Many of them expect a neat, tidy answer. My family is from this one country. My ancestors were only one type of people. But again and again, these tests reveal something far more complicated and honestly far more beautiful. Most people carry genetic threads from multiple regions, multiple migrations, multiple stories layered on top of each other. Ancient empires like the Mongols played a massive, silent role in creating that complexity. Somewhere in that data, without anyone announcing it directly, could be tiny fragments connecting ordinary people today to the enormous, sweeping story of the Mongol Empire. A grandmother in Kazakhstan, a shopkeeper in northern China, a student in Turkey, a worker in Hungary. Regions the Mongol Empire once touched directly or indirectly still carry faint genetic echoes of that history, woven quietly into millions of family. Trees. Most of those people will never know it. They will go through their entire lives never realizing that a tiny, quiet thread inside them stretches back to horse riders on the open steppe, to a broken boy named Temujin, who became an emperor, to an empire that once controlled more land than almost any other power in human history. Doesn't it feel strange and somehow beautiful to think that history is not only something we read about, but something some of us are literally still carrying inside us? If this idea is starting to sit heavy in your chest, take a breath, because the next part of this story asks an even bigger question. Not just who the Mongols were, but why we chose to remember them the way we did. Here's something worth sitting with. Why did the destructive image of the Mongols become so much stronger, so much more famous, than the more complicated, more human reality? Part of the answer lies in who was doing the writing. Most surviving historical accounts about the Mongols were written by scholars from the civilizations the Mongols conquered or threatened. Chinese court historians, Persian scribes, European monks. Understandably, many of these writers focused heavily on the destruction, the fear, and the trauma their own people experienced. That is completely human. If your city was burned, if your family was affected by war, you are not going to sit down and write a balanced, gentle account of the empire responsible. You are going to write from pain, and pain, understandably, tends to remember the worst moments the loudest. Over centuries, those painful accounts became the dominant story passed down through history books, movies, and popular culture. The complicated, connected, diverse reality of the Mongol world slowly faded into the background, overshadowed by simpler, scarier images. DNA does not carry emotion. It does not carry fear or trauma or bias. It simply records what actually happened, biologically, generation after generation. And that is exactly why it is now helping historians rebalance a story that had become one-sided for far too long. This does not erase the real suffering caused during the Mongol conquests. That suffering was real, and it deserves to be remembered honestly. But alongside that painful truth, there is another truth that deserves equal space. The truth of connection, of mixing, of an empire that, intentionally or not, helped weave distant parts of humanity together in ways that still echo inside millions of people today. Both truths can exist at the same time. Violence and connection, destruction and blending, fear and legacy. History is very rarely simple enough to fit into only one emotion. If you've ever felt like your own family's story is more complicated than the short version people usually hear, maybe share this video with them. Because somewhere in a story like this, people often start reflecting on their own hidden histories too. Let's bring this all the way back to where we started. The idea of a hidden grave and a hidden truth. Genghis Khan's burial place remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. No confirmed tomb has ever been found, despite decades of searching by historians, archaeologists, and adventurers. Some believe his remains lie somewhere in the Khenti Mountains of Mongolia, a region considered deeply sacred and largely left undisturbed out of respect and tradition. In a strange way, that missing grave has become the perfect symbol for this entire story. For centuries, we thought we understood the Mongols completely. We had a clear picture in our minds. Savage, destructive, simple. But just like his actual burial place, the full truth about who the Mongols were has remained hidden, buried underneath layers of biased history, incomplete records, and centuries of fear-driven storytelling. Ancient DNA is slowly digging through those layers, not with shovels, but with careful, patient science. And what it is revealing is a story far richer than the one most of us grew up believing. Yes, the Mongols conquered enormous territories through real, devastating violence. That part of the story is true, and history should never soften that truth just to make a nicer narrative. But the same empire also connected distant civilizations. It reopened trade routes that boosted global exchange of goods and ideas for generations. It allowed unprecedented religious tolerance in many of its territories, and biologically it left behind a genetic legacy that still lives quietly inside millions of people scattered across Asia and beyond, whether they realize it or not. The Mongols were not simply villains from an old adventure story. They were real human beings, capable of extreme violence and extreme connection at the same time. Complicated, contradictory, deeply, unmistakably human. And maybe that is the biggest lesson hidden inside all of this ancient DNA research. History is almost never as simple as the stories we were first told. The people of the past were not cartoon characters, purely good or purely evil. They were complicated humans, shaped by fear, ambition, survival, and circumstance, just like we are today. Somewhere out there, right now, someone is walking around with a tiny genetic thread connecting them back to that same ancient step. Back to that same broken boy who became an emperor, back to an empire that once reshaped almost half the known world. They will probably never know it. But the story is still there, quietly written into their blood, waiting patiently, the same way it waited hidden for 800 years inside an unmarked grave somewhere in the Mongolian mountains. Maybe that is what history really is. Not just old stories and old books, but living threads, stretching silently through time, connecting people who will never meet to events they will never fully understand, in ways science is only just beginning to uncover. The Mongols were never simply who we thought they were, and maybe, in some small hidden way, neither are we. If this story changed, even a small part of how you see the Mongols, or made you wonder what hidden threads might be inside your own bloodline, let it sit with you for a moment before you go, because some truths take a while to fully settle in,